From the Blind Ability Studios, it's Wellness Wednesday with your hosts, Beth Gustin and Robin Ennis.
Welcome to Wellness Wednesday. My name is Robin Ennis, and I am here with my co-partner facilitator, Beth Gustin, and we are going to talk about guilt. So we are leading off of our last podcast surrounding shame. So as we mentioned before, there's a difference between shame and guilt. And so today we're going to define guilt.
Yes, and there are different types of guilt. And so I think it makes sense to start with the different types of guilt. And then kind of per our usual format, we'll talk about some ways to work with the guilt and try to lessen the guilt. So most of us are familiar with a concept called survivorous guilt. Mm-hmm. We see this a lot in working with clients who are experiencing grief, whether it's someone maybe survived a car accident and a loved one did not, or natural disaster or a traumatic event. If one sibling experienced abuse and one did not, things like that, we see survivor's guilt. And that is basically guilt where one person didn't experience or have the same outcome as the other person, and they feel like they should have maybe experienced the same thing, or they feel like there's something they could have done to prevent the event. And I'm going to back up one quick second, and I want to define guilt as a whole. So last week we defined shame as there is something wrong with me. Guilt is I've done something wrong. I did something or didn't do something. I said or didn't say something that I should have said or shouldn't have said. And I feel guilty and want to make amends or want to make it right.
Yeah. What my perception is that with guilt, there's always a way that you can, quote unquote, try and fix it. Whereas shame, it feels like you can't fix it because it's something wrong with you. You are the root problem. The guilt there is trying to find ways to rectify it.
I agree with that. And I think that's where it gets a little bit tricky, because with guilt, we feel like there is something we can do to fix it, but sometimes there isn't anything we can do to fix it.
Yep, I agree. And so, speaking of, national disasters, is the fires in Louisville. I have a client who lives in that area. And so their home wasn't impacted by the fires, but they had that survivor's guilt. And so they felt bad because all of their friends' homes were impacted. And so one way that they tried to rectify that guilt was to give back by donating items or financially. And so I think that could, it's a good thing that they want to give back, but then also too, it can be a double-edged sword, right? Because you can do certain things, but to what extent? And sometimes you may feel like you're not doing enough when in actuality you are, or you don't even really need to, in terms of just because you survived, you shouldn't feel like you have to give back in that way.
I agree with that 100%. And this leads to another type of guilt in a sense. And so there are what's called false guilt or unmerited guilt versus, I guess you could say, true guilt or merited guilt. So unmerited or false guilt is situations where you didn't do anything wrong. You didn't cause the event, but you feel like you did.
Yeah.
Versus true guilt or merited guilt, where it's like, yeah, you did do something that caused the event. And hopefully you can do something to fix it. And this gets tricky and this gets really hard. I have a lot of clients experiencing different types of guilt in a lot of the grief and loss work that I do. And most of the time, no matter what type of guilt we're experiencing, we can't change the outcome. And most time we didn't cause the outcome. So I will occasionally I do a lot of work with pet loss grief as well as human death loss grief. And in pet loss grief, I will often see clients who might have left the gate open and their dog got out. That is merited guilt because unfortunately the gate was left open completely accidentally. It was not intentional. But that is an example of merited guilt in a sense, because if the gate hadn't been left open, maybe the event would have been prevented.
Right.
That's an example where that guilt can come into play, versus unmerited or false guilt where, well, if I a blank.
See, I think of caregiver based upon that. And I have a client whose wife died of a long battle of an illness. And so there was that guilt of, did I do everything that I could? I should have stayed home more often, or I should have done this to encourage her to be more proactive with her health.
Yes.
I think that a lot of caregivers do go through that false guilt.
I agree. I want to point out we are using the word should a lot tonight. And I don't like it when anyone shoulds on themselves, because should actually causes guilt. Oh,
that's true. Or
can cause a sense of guilt. And so because it implies there's something we could have done differently. So I just encourage, even as we're having this conversation, to reduce the use of the word should when we can.
Good point. That is very true. Or it creates false responsibility in the wrong place. So that's definitely a mindful insight. Yeah.
So what do we do with all this guilt? Because it doesn't feel good at all.
Nope.
And I think there's a number of different things that we can do to work with the guilt and try to reduce it. Obviously, if you did do something that you can do something about, then make amends where you can.
Mm-hmm.
Make the apologies where you can, right the wrongs that you can. Now, that's the key words, that you can. Because like I said, like we talked about, sometimes there's nothing else we can do.
Mm-hmm.
And even if you could, it wouldn't change anything.
Yep.
And so a huge piece of the work I do with clients is actually around self-forgiveness and helping them work towards that self-compassion, self-forgiveness piece around, I did everything I could. This wasn't my fault. And this does not happen in one session. I'll tell you that right now. This is some harder, deeper work, but I think it is one of the better ways to help ourselves let go of guilt. And there's a lot of rituals that I recommend around letting go of guilt, because holding on to it doesn't serve us.
No. I also encourage people to recognize the feeling, put a name to it. So if you are feeling guilt, okay, I'm feeling guilt because of this, to try and normalize it and know what you're going through, that other people have gone through it, and trying to find the best way to navigate it versus pushing it down. I know in terms of grief, guilt is definitely one of the stages that can help you be able to know where you are in that moment, and knowing that, trying to not put that false expectation or that false belief that you are the only one navigating what you're navigating. That can be helpful. I know it's been helpful in terms of my own situations when I've grieved different losses.
I think it's also really important to talk to somebody about the guilt you're experiencing.
Mm-hmm.
Being able to let somebody else know can just take a lot of pressure off yourself. And I'm a huge fan of letter writing. Even if you have nowhere to send the letter, I think writing about how you're feeling and either keeping it if you want to, but I think it's also more important to let it go. Whether it's burying it, burning it, sailing it down a river, tearing it up, whatever you choose to do.
Mm-hmm.
But finding some way to acknowledge it, give it a voice, and let it go.
Yeah, that's my favorite one that I like to recommend to clients. One of my clients, she's like, can I just mail it? I'll feel better if I just mail it. I'm like, well, how about you just write it? Because again, grief can be in different areas of life. So it doesn't have to be necessarily just a person who is deceased, but it could be the loss of a relationship or what may be. But yes, getting it out so that it won't be festered and stuck inside and you won't be ruminating on it. I found clients who find that very helpful. Actually, the letter writing. You can also talk out loud. It's called the empty chair strategy. So pretending, whether it's a person you're having that type of guilt about or feelings, pretending that they're in that chair, or even, Beth, you mentioned a pet. So pretending that the pet is there. What would you say to that pet? And trying to get out feelings that way, because pets definitely are a part of our family. So I get how that grief can definitely be very, very strong.
Or talk to the picture if you're able to see a picture. Talk to the picture. Talk in your head if you don't have privacy and can't talk out loud. I want to go back for a second. As far as sending the letter that you've written, I definitely encourage clients to write it first.
Yes.
And then I encourage them to, I don't need to hear the letter in session unless they want to share it with me, but let's talk about what you wrote, and then decide if sending it is really going to solve anything.
Right. Yeah.
Because oftentimes what I've experienced with my clients is they don't need to send it once they've written it.
That's true. Yeah.
They don't feel that need anymore.
Yeah. Those words don't have the power over them.
Right. Because what you're doing essentially when you write something down or you talk it out, you talk to the person, you write to the person, you're acknowledging what you're feeling and you're getting out of your head, like I said earlier, and that you take away the power, I think. You take away the emotion behind the words. And that's really what needs to happen. That's why therapists often suggest letter writing, because it is a good way to take away the power that those emotions and words are having over you.
Right. Do you have any other ideas in terms of guilt?
I don't personally like this suggestion, but I'm going to throw it out there because some people do. There are some people who find it helpful if they pick a date. Like, I'm going back to the grief and loss theme here because it's what I specialize in, so it's what I have the most experience with. but like the loved one's birthday.
Mm-hmm.
And you're going to decide that as soon as that day comes, you are not going to feel guilty anymore. And you kind of have like a no guilt deadline, essentially, for yourself. And if you can stick with that, that's great. That can help. I personally find that harder because sometimes different events in our life can trigger guilt to come back. But some do find that really helpful because it gives them kind of something to work towards as they're working with their guilt.
Right. And I'm glad you mentioned that, right? So guilt can come back. It is a feeling, just like any other emotion and feeling, it can come and go. The more that you resolve guilt and the more that you feel better, the less frequent it is. But there will be times when you'll get triggered and it comes back. And that's okay too. If that does happen, just re-engaging in those coping strategies to try and help you keep moving forward. And also too, realizing the level of expectation that you're setting for yourself. Are you setting it too high? Is that why guilt is popping up? Being in tune with how you're feeling as a person.
I agree with that. And there's one last thing I'd like to mention about guilt before we wrap up. And that is, I think it's important to figure out what holding on to the guilt does for you. I think we tend to see, at least in my work, my clients will hold on to the guilt because if they let go of the guilt, they will somehow let go of the person, or they're somehow maybe punishing themselves for something. And so they hold on to that guilt because they feel like they deserve to feel miserable. Or if I let go of the guilt, then I might have to feel more painful emotions that are harder to cope with. And so I think it's important to be aware of, how is the guilt serving you?
Right.
Because it's really not, but that's not what we initially think about or acknowledge when we're feeling guilt.
Right. And to go off of that, that's a really good point, Beth. And so I've been told too that pertaining to people, because I have a lot of clients who have unexpected loss, whether it's due to death or chronic illness or disability. And so I was told by another professional that people who tend to hold on to that guilt or blame, it's a way of having control, right? So
yes. Yeah.
In life, how if things seem like they're powerless and they can't control what's going on around them, the one thing that they can control is how they feel or how they react to those circumstances. So turning that blame inward, that's one thing that they can control. And so just trying to be mindful of that. Life can be scary, especially if you've had a lot of unexpected events occur, but try and think of some other ways to try and control what's going on around you versus having that self-judgment or that blame or shame putting on you.
When I work with clients around what they can control, I get really basic. So you can control what time you get up in the morning. You can control what you eat for breakfast if you eat breakfast. You can control what you're going to wear. So, there's a lot more within our control if we break it down to basics than we realize. And I think remembering what you can control actually helps you start to let go of the guilt.
Yeah.
Or at least start to look at why you're holding on to it.
I agree. And like Beth mentioned earlier, to help you navigate that you can always reach out to a therapist, especially if you have insurance. If you call the number on your back of your insurance card, they can help you find a provider, as well as psychologytoday.com, or there are crisis line options. There's a lot of options where you can have a listening ear. Some therapists will work on sliding fee scales as well if you don't have insurance. Just know that you're not alone.
There's also therapyden.com and Open Path Collective. Open Path Collective is for affordable counseling for clients who need more affordable counseling. And if you just type in Google, if you're looking for a therapist to work on guilt or depression or anxiety or grief, you can put in, I don't know what guilt counselor would show up in the results with, but you could put in something counseling near me, for example, in Google, and that will pull up results as well.
Yeah, exactly.
And we are back again in October. So we will be back with episode 5.
Yes. Stay tuned for the topic. And again, if you have any ideas, let us know. I think I may have an idea, but I'll wait. It'll be a surprise.
It's, the season of Halloween, and we can do the trick or treat theme. It's going to be a treat, not a trick. We promise.
Right. Exactly. Until next time.
You can send Beth and Robin a message at 612-367-6093 or by email at info@blindabilities.com. They'd love to hear from you.
When we share
what we see through
each other's eyes, we can then begin to bridge the gap
between the limited expectations and the realities
of blind abilities.
and the realities of blind abilities.